Now, we've got on the agenda two ordinances which have been in committee, 3517 and 3518, regarding a policy on the waiver of penalty and interest on property and other taxes. 3517 is sponsored by myself and Mr. Stringfield, and it essentially says there will be no more waivers. 3518 was sponsored originally by myself, and it set up a policy, a staff recommendation for various categories of waivers and the legislature's involvement in some decision on waivers. Is there any testimony from the public or anyone on these two ordinances?
Mr. Mayor, may I speak to the legislature?
Yes.
Thank you.
You may. Please identify yourself.
My name is Bob Whitwell-Spuget. I live in Independence, Missouri.
Please proceed, Mr. Whitwell.
Thank you. The ordinance 3518 is legislation that should help the county collect real estate and personal property taxes. The legislative goal is to provide a means to preserve and enhance voluntary compliance by fairly and consistently, accurately administering a system of penalties. Such an ordinance must not weaken the government's ability to collect the proper amount of tax by confusing and diluting the behavior it intends to enforce. Penalties exist to encourage voluntary compliance by supporting the standards of expected behavior. Voluntary compliance currently consists of signing a self-assessment document, filing it timely, and paying taxes due by December 31st. Efforts made to fulfill these obligations constitute compliant behavior. Penalties may apply to behavior that fails to meet any and all of these obligations. Penalties should encourage voluntary compliance by the following: defining the standards of compliant behavior, defining remedial consequences for non-compliance, and providing monetary sanctions against taxpayers who do not meet the standard. These three factors support conviction that the tax system is fair and penalties are proportionate to the severity of non-compliance. The county has public obligation to advance the fairness and effectiveness of the tax system. Penalties should be severe enough to deter non-compliance and encourage non-compliant taxpayers to comply. Penalty waivers, therefore, should be granted only when compliance has been attained. Interest may be required on any balance that is untimely paid. The legislature should take this opportunity to educate itself regarding the causes for the delinquency by listening to taxpayers' reasons for non-compliance and review the documentation that is already available and made to the collection office. According to the ordinance, you will receive a weekly dose of commercial requests on which to make an informed decision. You must oversee also an impartial body to analyze responses from individuals which may indicate a legitimate and verifiable reason for abatement of a penalty. Leaving that in the hands of the Director of Collections, the same individual who violated the public trust for years, does not inspire the confidence of many. Consequently, passing this ordinance is instituting another unfunded mandate. We have heard how Jackson County hates that. No standard for waivers has previously been established. No one necessarily has the definitive key that automatically grants a waiver at the present time. Rules created are vaguely similar to those of the federal statutes, but these rules are significantly different, and some very questionable differences have entered the ordinance. Why have you requested exceptions for unverifiable facts and not established specific criteria? You may specify these standards and resist the temptation to entertain emotional appeals from taxpayers.
Excuse me.
Penalties.
Just a second. Would you shut that door?
I can tell you.
please.
Penalty waivers, I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
Penalty waivers should directly relate to the standards of behavior that are desirable. Taxpayer education on the new standards must be a large part of your effort to institute practical changes in compliance. If penalties aid the voluntary compliance, they support a fair and effective tax system. Then waivers of a penalty are even more crucial to preserve the public belief that compliance is a standard for which everyone must strive. Since maintaining documentation is a critical measure of compliance, performance, and public trust, how will the legislature review requests for commercial and business waivers and handle public concerns for requester privacy? Although I respect your desire to take quick action on most any issue of this magnitude, with the fiscal impact already measured in the millions and the compliance standards for tens of thousands of tax accounts blindly being decided, why would you endorse an action plan by means of a hastily written ordinance that is full of loopholes and ripe for the perpetuation of fiscal corruption which has surfaced in many county policies? This action should not be undertaken lightly. There is good reason for the state and county to support the status quo of keeping tax waivers illegal. Pass on that can of worms. Let's go fishing. That's all I have to say. Any
Thank
questions?
you. Are there any questions for Mr. Witzelsfugen?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Spence?
you said this was an unfunded mandate?
It would be.
How's that?
Well, you're asking the collection department to do more than what they're currently doing. How are you going to fund these positions for review of penalty waivers?
I'm sure we would, if we followed through on some ordinance, we would set it up so that they could handle it.
Well, there's currently no fiscal attachment to this.
Well, so far we haven't passed an ordinance either.
That's true.
Is there any other questions? Mr. Stringfield?
You had mentioned, what you were mentioning is the ordinance 3518.
That's
You didn't
correct.
say anything about 3517. So I assume that, do you have anything to say about that? Because we're talking about 35 and 17, no discretions.
Yeah, and that sounds like a final decision on tax waiver issues. I have experience that tells me that such a fiscal policy of penalty waivers is necessary in some instances. I do not find those instances necessarily referenced in the current 3518. I would lean toward further review by the legislature and specifically the Finance Committee on what is practical to institute, not necessarily eliminating future consideration of penalty waivers. But the one ordinance that you currently have does not meet the guidelines that I would consider worthy of public trust.
All right, thank you very much
Thank you.
for your testimony. Is there any discussion of either ordinances at this